neurodivergent. You know what? Can we skip this?
NDAF.
Perfect.
Hi. This is Mark Wheaton, and welcome to another episode of NDAF, a space in which neurodivergent folks and their friends can talk all things spectrumy in any messy direction they want. With me, as always, is my silent, never-speaking producer and engineer, Ken Plume. And this week, we're welcoming horror author, editor, and publisher, Aquino Loayza, to the show. First became aware of Aquino's work as the editor of Spectrum, an autistic horror anthology, but also as the writer of one of my favorite stories in it, Neighborly. I sought out her novel Deep, and it stopped me in my tracks. It's such a great and beautifully written horror novel that maybe you should just shut off this podcast if you haven't read it and seek it out now. If you have read it and are as dying to hear what she has to say about the book as I am, please listen on as we welcome to the show Aquino Loayza. I guess kicking off, I'm just really happy that you responded to us. And I thank you so much for doing this podcast, whatever the hell this is. As I said, when I reached out to you, I read Neighborly first in this because of Sam Van Rooyen's book, but then I read Deep. And I used to write for Fangorious. I'm used to telling filmmakers, oh, that was so good. And it's like the worst thing you've ever seen. It's amazing to actually be page after page after page being like, this thing's sensational. It's philosophical. It's folk horror. It's just this beautiful epic about these interwoven lives. So I was just and that was before I even got to the ending. And I was like, I really hope you would want to talk to us about this. So I'm glad you're here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I started writing Deep at 22 years old. It's my first attempt at a novel as an adult. And I pantsed the whole thing. There was no outline. I just let it flow through me.
Well, it works. It works really, really well. And if people who are listening to this, could you tell us a little about what it is without giving away where it kind of goes?
Sure. So I like to tell people it's a Lynchian fever dream interfused with Lovecraftian elements through a more contemporary lens and through a queer lens. In the backdrop of Maine, it's basically a love letter to New England horror. I'm obviously from Boston. I've spent a large part of my life in Maine and a lot of great memories there. And I wanted to respect that in the way that a horror writer does, which is by making it downright terrifying. But yeah, I would say a Lovecraftian fever dream with Lynchian elements to it. And that's basically how I would describe that book without spoiling it. It's kind of hard to get into too much detail with it.
I actually would totally agree. I love that as I'm because I read it both and listened to Rain Corbin's audiobook version of it because I tend to do that. It's an amazing audiobook also. So as an experience, and I think I actually missed it on the page and then heard it on the audio that Stephen King is a character, but there and gone, is in the universe and gone. So that was also really neat.
Absolutely.
So when you say you started writing it at 22, how did you start writing? When you were very young and at 22 you decided to tackle a novel, or what were you writing before?
I've always been a bit of a writer. I'm on the spectrum. I'm autistic, have hyperfixated interest. At one point when I was in middle school, I wrote a book on modern imperialism because I'm a dork. And that was kind of where my writing started, but eventually I kind of started to move more into fiction, creating characters. And I've always been in the horror genre. I've always had an appreciation for exploring discomfort through that lens. And I took a trip up to Acadia one summer for a week and a half. And I came back and said, you know what? I think I'm going to finally tackle a novel. I think I'm going to finally get something on a page in long form prose. And it just started flowing. I thought at first maybe it might be a short story, but then I got about 30, 40 pages in and I was like, no, there's a lot here to explore. And there's a final version of Deep that doesn't exist out there in the world that's almost 600 pages. So I really cut it back quite a bit.
I'd read that though. So it's such a rich universe and the characters are so rich that it's, I would totally read the 600-page version. Is there a town you had in mind in coastal Maine that you were thinking of for Junebird?
Actually, it's based off of a post-industrial city in Massachusetts, just interplaced over into Maine. So it's supposed to be set near Cutler, kind of near the Canadian border, as far up on the coast as you can go. I've been there on many, many hikes as part of the research of getting the landscape right and things like that and the atmosphere. It really is that foggy there all year round. I've been in July and it's that foggy, and I've been there in October and it's that foggy. But it's meant to be Fitchburg, Massachusetts, which is this post-industrial mill town, kind of falling on hard times with a little bit more of a coastal seasoning.
Have people recognized it as Fitchburg? Like, do Fitchburgians read this and go, wait a minute, I know where this is, transposed to Maine?
Not yet, actually. I've had people guess mill towns around Fitchburg, which is close, but nobody from Fitchburg has proclaimed it to be their own. But that's very much so inspired by that city.
So when you're starting to write the short stories and you're starting to get into horror, as a teenager, what are you reading? What are you watching? What are you kind of consuming at a young age that you're like, I could do that too. This is my gateway drug into writing my own.
It's funny. It was mostly film that really got me interested. I've read a lot of Stephen King. My favorite Stephen King novel is most people's least favorite Stephen King novel. Just because it was
Colorado
like the first
Kid.
one.
I'm like, which one?
Dreamcatcher. A lot of people hate Dreamcatcher, and I tell people that, and they're like, "Oh, we don't like you anymore." But I just read it at the right time. Like I was 12 years old. My brain had developed enough to really understand the concepts that were being laid on the page. Like I think I had read it a little bit before that, which is a choice. But at that time, it was like hitting me right at the right developmental stage of my brain to really imagine that. I read a lot of Lovecraft. The Shadows of Innsmouth's also very influential to Deep, but a lot of A24 art house horror movies. I've always found the horror that I really engage with is horror that is trying to tackle something on a deeper level, but is okay with letting us live in that discomfort and ambiguity. The movie that really kind of kicked it into high gear for me for Deep was probably not a surprise, but the reasons why it is a surprise, I would say, is The Lighthouse. It's my favorite horror movie ever. It's not surprising that it's deep, but the ways that it influences Deep is less to do with the nautical themes and the insanity part of it and more the ambiguity of all of it. To not spoil Deep too much, it's very much so intentionally left up for the reader's interpretation of how much one character is painted in one light or the other. And that's very much so a stylistic choice on my part to not give you the answers on how should you feel about this person. Because there's one character in particular, you follow through a lot of it. I would say that his actions can be painted in a really good light or a really bad light, depending on your own experience you're bringing into the novel. So yeah, that ambiguity of it. And a lot of my favorite horror just kind of doesn't give you those answers. They let you kind of stew in it and marinate. And I think that the greatest fear that we all have is the fear of the unknown, the fear of not having clarity or understanding.
The more people I've talked to on this and like out in the real world, bringing an autistic perspective into horror, there's so much of that, like because of empathy and because of like, wait, that's not just, there's an injustice problem here, or just how things are portrayed when people kind of look at you odd for whatever behavior, characteristic, or trait you're expressing at the time. I have found a lot of people attracted to seeing themselves in horror, but also writing in horror. Do you think that's part of what got you into this?
In some ways it is. I'm very aware that there's not many indigenous trans queer authors in any genre, but particularly horror has been very much so a white male dominated space. Nothing against them, but I feel that only encapsulates so much of the human experience. And a large part of what I tried to do with Spectrum and other stuff is to give other people's experiences. Like you said at the top, you had read Spectrum. And so you should know that book has a lot of variety. There's a lot of different lived experiences in that. And that was very much so an intentional choice. I actually wrote Neighborly first. I was like, this story is really weird. I love it. But I want to, instead of create a short story collection of my autistic experience, see if I can widen the tapestry a little bit and give voices to other people who are autistic, who don't have the same lived experience as me. So yeah, it's always a little bit about representation, but I feel like that's the first step towards true integration, is to be exposed to it. And then the next step is really giving us positions of power. And unfortunately, when you're a brown trans person, it's really hard to be given that. You have to kind of carve it and take it. And that's what I've done, right? Like I run Third Estate Books. I came in with not a lot of resources, very much so a do-it-yourself punk attitude, and carved my own lane for the people behind me that come in to make it a little bit easier on them.
Let's talk a little about the editorial process on Spectrum, because there's not just stories from autistic perspectives. There's also writing that feels very like, the way something's described, the way something switches to script, the way something switches to lists. There's a very different kind of, there's a not neurotypical kind of way into a lot of the ways of just writing. And we've talked about this on this show before. Chuck Tingle has talked about having to kind of not de-autism his writing, but recognize certain things in his writing that he wanted removed, that he thought wasn't effective. Did you see some of that when you're editing and going through these just hundreds of stories that came in?
Honestly, I met the authors where they were. To me, there's two ways to go about it, right? There's how can I make this as palatable to as many people as possible and make this voice as streamlined in a way that allows neurotypical people to understand it. Or you can take the approach of this is an explicitly autistic piece and I'm never going to be able to reach everybody in the ways that I want them to understand this. So the way that I approached it with my authors is I wanted to maintain their voice, their vision of things, and hold true to the integrity of the art that they were trying to accomplish. A lot of those pieces didn't require much editing other than maybe slight expansions of ideas or reordering the way in which information was flowed. You mentioned Zan earlier. I actually was the editor on Zan's story, and that story changed very lightly from the one we received to the one that went out to print. And that's because I trusted Zan's vision of what they were trying to tell. And that's one of my favorite stories in the whole collection. I absolutely love that story. It's so beautiful. And there wasn't really much to change. Just like, maybe we can make this slight element a little bit more overt because it took me a few times to pick up on it types of things. But there wasn't really a lot of fundamental restructuring of stories because artistic integrity is probably the number one thing here at Third Estate. Very few of us go into publishing with the hopes of being rich and famous. So I would rather that, like, if the book doesn't sell well, at least that when you read it, you go, that's exactly what I wanted it to be. And that means you have to be a little more particular about finding projects that speak to you as well as the artists on equal levels. But the result of that is maintaining the heart and soul of what that project was that you were given.
That's one of the reasons I reached out to Zan right away with this podcast thing. When I read Zan's story, it echoed my own experience of sound and the soundscape that I've kind of battled against since I was a little kid because of autism. And it was something that the way Zan wrote it, I was like, this is how, if I could have, I would have written that kind of experience, that kind of soundscape. And so when I started reading their other work, I was like, the sensory experience that's on the page in the Helix books and elsewhere really made sense to me. And so I really responded to that. And what's interesting is with Spectrum, as you say, there's so many different voices. There are ones that I didn't respond to because I was like, I can't get into that experience in that same way. I still could respond to it as a story, but it in no way, because of how individualized one's experience of autism is, I was like, no, that's not me at all. And that was amazing. So I really liked the full scope that the anthology presented. Do you have a favorite story? Do you have ones that you're like, this is me in the stories?
It's hard to say. I would say 4 stories that I really, really, really loved. There's the Chris Nelson one, which is not really me, but the way that it's formatted is so strange and so archaic, and it's so ambiguous, and it's time hopping between a play and some others. I really love that story. I don't want to spoil it too much. Zan's was, all of the editors had a choice of, like, this is the one story that I don't care what you say, this is going in there. And that was mine. I love that story really with a lot of my heart. John Wiswell's But the Wi-Fi is Great is a cheeky throwback to like a certain type of almost like, I don't know, like creep showy types of vibes to it. I really love the humor of it. And then there's Akis's story, which has very Greek sensibilities to it. Obviously, it's talking about the sun getting closer every day. That's a really beautiful story. Typically if I'm trying to write like my standard style of prose, it's probably the most similar to his style of prose if I'm writing on my own volition, but I tend to really embody the characters in the time period or the location that I'm writing in. As I'm sure you saw when you read Neighborly, it is very different than Deep's prose style. Like, it could not be more different. A lot of people were surprised that it was the same author. So
I have to say that's one of the reasons I downloaded the new one, the Monologist, because I was just like, I read the description. I was like, again, same author, but this doesn't sound at all in the same. I haven't even started it, but it doesn't even feel like it's in the same category, which obviously I find very commendable. If I can ask, it's interesting that you mentioned Dreamcatcher because of the shadow of Stephen King. Stephen King has, going back to The Shining, he's evolved over time, the way he presents autism. In Shining, it's the worst thing possible. There's a whole scene where they're like, oh no, could Danny have autism? And they're very afraid of it. And then through The Stand, obviously some of the autism coding of Carrie herself, and then up to Duddits in Dreamcatcher. But then now with Mr. Mercedes, he now has a much more fully realized autistic lead who then carries through all those and then into The Outsider and now into her own book. It's interesting that you say the first one you read was Dreamcatcher. How did you feel about Duddits at 12 years old? How did you feel about a character that very specifically is autism coded and might have been challenging for some, but at some point you're just kind of grasping at straws for representation anyway. So how did you feel about that? Or do you even remember?
I was diagnosed at 13, so I read it before I was diagnosed.
Right.
But, obviously I still had autism. I just didn't know it. I related to Duddits in a lot of ways. I felt like, to me, it showed somebody who had deep empathy of trying to understand neurodivergence, but just doesn't. And at some point, it sounds like in his life, he was better able to grasp and understand the nuances of such things. But like you said, it was representation of any kind. And at that point, most people didn't really know what autism was. It was demonized. It still is in a lot of ways. But at that time, there wasn't any representation at all. I think Big Bang Theory hadn't even come out yet, right? And right. That's still also super harmful stereotypicalness of autism representation. So it was just a complete dearth and a complete lack thereof. So I guess all that to say that I was happy to see that there were characters who had mental and neurological conditions in novels. I wasn't happy with the way that it was portrayed, but also I was 12 years old and didn't have the ability to intellectualize the nuances therein of that representation and what that meant in a broader societal level.
My generation, I'm like still in the shadow of like Rain Man and Curious Incident, The Dog in the Nighttime. And people are like, oh yeah, there's so many people I know who are neurodivergent who read Curious Incident and are like, that's me, and went and got a diagnosis, like understood autism better because of it, but also were ingesting a book that said it's okay to be abusive. It's okay you absolutely understand a mother who's like, it's too hard to raise an autistic kid. I'm just going to flee to London. So there was the bad, but then it's the only thing. So you meet a lot of people who are like, well, they have a very bifurcated view of Curious Incident. So it's not one thing or the other.
It's true.
So can I ask about Peter in Deep? Is that a character that you set up specifically to represent autism? Is that a character that is autistic in Deep, or is it just me reading too much into it?
Actually, I would say that Peter of all the characters is the most like how I was in real life at that point. I would say that Geo is actually the one that I would say is autistic. Coded.
Because the alcohol, because of the hyperfixation on Junebirth? Because I saw some of that too. Peter seemed more aggressive in that because of how he spoke and because of that. But Geo's fixations also felt the same. So
yeah, and there's layers, right? There's a spectrum. I think Peter's the most like me, so I think that's probably accidentally looking more autistic because he's just very similarly over the top, bombastic, very towny, very jokey. He's the comic relief. He's the best friend. Geo's like hyperfixations and ruminations and circular patterns of thought that never really result in anything different is something that I relate to very much so on some levels and some days. And Geo was definitely meant to be more autistic coded because he couldn't see other people's emotions around him in the way that they wanted to be seen. Like he couldn't step outside of himself in a way that almost everybody else in the book showed capable of, with the exception of Geo. Like he was the center of the narrative in his world. And maybe that's partly because we're mostly seeing it through his eyes. Maybe that's partly because he is. That's the ambiguity of it, right? But that Peter was definitely most like me. So if you caught the autism in it, it's probably because you could see me on the page. But the one that was intentionally autistic coded was Giovanni.
Funny because Geo, I'm not sure I can give this away. I'm not going to, but he is forced out. And there's a question to me of whether or not he is a different person at the end, which I really like. I like that. And trying not to give it away, but I liked where he ended up very much. So is that too spoilery for a podcast?
It's been out for 2 years. So It's actually going to be 2 years in about a week now. So if you want to talk
congratulations,
spoilers,
happy anniversary.
Thank
That's
you.
Great.
If you want to get spoilery, by all means, it's been out for 2 years. If it gets people to want to read how we get there, then that's all the power to them. I could use any nickel that people want to spend on it.
So what do you think of that? When you take Geo to that place, there were different avenues. There were different endings for Geo. Again, trying not to jump right on it, but there were different endings for Geo. And I found the ending fascinating. I loved where it ends. I love how it ends. I love the last 2 chapters. And I was just curious if you can talk around your decision-making process in having this character go to that in the final 2 chapters.
Sure. So a lot of it is, to me, the repeating cycles of trauma and how the cycles of trauma that we inflict on ourselves can be almost as catastrophizing as the traumas that we inflict onto others, right? Like, I think there's a point, and I'm not going to spoil what happens, where Gio has two very clear choices that he can kind of make and embrace. And he makes one and then follows it up with another choice that almost undoes it in some ways at the very, very end, where he has a choice of, I'm not going to say what, but being honest, essentially. I'm not going to say about what, but being honest and being open and kind of starting new or leaning back into this husk and shield of himself that he has built to justify the ways that he's behaved and the ways that he's kind of centered himself and the ways that he's taken advantage of people around him. And he chooses to justify that behavior and continue the cycle of trauma that he's inflicting on others. But really, all it is catastrophizing himself. He's only stopping himself from truly growing and truly learning from what's come. And I think that's a pattern of behavior that I've seen in lots of people, obviously in much less dramatic stakes. But a lot of people take the wrong lessons from the traumas learned, right? We become avoidant of replication in some ways while not understanding that the behavior that we're using to avoid that replication is a replication onto itself. And that's a lot of what Gio is he can't get out of his own way to actualize his own happiness in the way that he actually wants, because he can't see outside of himself enough to know what that happiness actually looks like. I'm sure that's confusing without getting into specifics, but...
Well, I get it. And so that actually leads me to the question about Mango, which is an odd place to go. But Gio feels very responsible for the dog, Mango, very detached from the dog, very concerned about Mango. Can you talk a little about why that relationship might be easier for Gio than other relationships, that not necessarily transactional relationship that autistic people often have with pets, or things that just, it's very much easier in that kind of back and forth. I was really interested in the part Mango plays in the story, in his emotional life, because the book is so character driven and so emotional. It really kind of signposts a lot of places where Gio's real feelings are on the page.
Yeah, so I think Mango is representative of two things, right? It's the promise of a life that no longer exists in a way. It's the last piece of fabric tying him to Adam, right? Like, that is the manifestation of what their love built into, is that dog. So if he loses Mango, he's losing that part of himself in his head. Never mind the fact that, like, how much of Adam is really about Juneberg to him is pretty unclear, and purposely left that way. But in his own head, Mango is the manifestation of that relationship. And it's very clear that he loves Adam, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's good for him.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of it. Like, Mango is that purity, that soul, that promise, and holding on to that in something that does have agency, but is not able to articulate it in a way that humans can, so therefore really doesn't. And that says a lot about how Gio views the world. The pet is a tying point to somebody else, not its own thing in its own way. Because even though it's a sentient being, it's not of the sentience that humans possess. So therefore, it's not able to articulate its own needs and desires in the ways that we can. So there's always some emotional transference that comes with that.
Yeah, because I really like the relationship between Gio and Peter also. Can you talk to that a little bit, why that might be an easier relationship for Gio also, to have a relationship with Peter, and what Peter may aspire to out of by being close with Gio?
I think Peter's just an empath who really wants to enjoy his life and his existence and cares about Gio. And I think he's one of those people, when he sees somebody in suffering, he wants to help. And Gio is, quite simply put, much easier able to function in all of his relationships that don't have to do with Juneberg. There's an obsession there that's unhealthy, unsustainable, untenable, but maintains in his psyche. And there's reasons for that, as you know, later on in the book, that are beyond his own control. But the reality is that's a relationship that wasn't born of Juneberg, that wasn't born of his obsession, that wasn't born of him trying to find purpose in his life. It was something that was truly and entirely about camaraderie and brotherhood and kinship, that wasn't predicated on furthering an end. So it's much easier for him to maintain that relationship. But even then, as you see him going into Juneberg, the joviality becomes a little bit more strained as time goes on and his situations unfurl, which justifiably so. I think a lot of us would be a little bit untenable in those circumstances, but that's also a product of him being close to the thing that compels him.
When you're working on something like this, is there anything that you kind of recognize, since it is your first novel, anything you kind of recognize in your process and you're writing that you're like, I'm much better at this because of my autism, or my autism kind of holds me back in this. It allows you to write 5,000 words a day and just keep cranking. It allows me to do the research. It allows me to hyperfixate, but it's hard to socialize. It's hard to market. It's hard to publicize. How does autism affect your creative process, but also you as a publisher?
So it's funny because it kind of works on the opposite. Like when I'm locked in on books, I can write 10,000 words in a day, but there will be like 3-4 weeks where I'm not in that character's head. I can't do it. Like I'm a slow writer. Deep took me 3 years to write. The Monologist took me 1.5 years. I think there's some considerable improvement in turnaround time on that. Slowly getting better. I'm working on another book right now. And that's going to take some time. But when it comes to marketing and stuff, because I know how to make people laugh, I know how I'm pretty good at masking. Most people aren't able to clock me as autistic in public spaces. I can be pretty charming and charismatic. My marketing is always really fun. Like, for example, for Deep, we had somebody in costume as a Slicker Man go up with us to Maine in October and do photos and videos in the water in October in the full Slicker Man costume. And that was really fun and really cool and really different for an indie novel to be doing. I have a very strong artistic vision because of my autism. It makes collaborating a little bit more difficult because I have a really strong sense of what I want to do. Editing can be a little bit difficult with editors. It's not like we fight and argue like, no, you're wrong. No, I'm right. It's more like, no, I know what I'm going for here. Maybe you're not picking up on it, and that's okay, but you got to trust me. I know where I'm going with this. And you'll see that the Monologist has much less editing than Deep. Deep, I hired an editor as my first time, who I think understood most of my vision, but didn't understand all of it. There's one particular sentence in the novel that I always think about when I think about the editor, because they just didn't get it. There's a scene where Forsberg is in his car and the radio is yelling at him in the Slicker Man voice. And I had originally wrote, oh, great, the radio is being facetious now. I apologize for the swear. And the editor changed it to flippant. And I don't know why it bothers me so much, but facetious feels so much better to me. And every time I read that, I'm just like, I have so much remorse that I allowed that version to go to print. But it's little things like that which makes it hard for the autism, is the collaboration elements of it, not so much the creating or the marketing.
Are there things, though, like that were changed that you're like, oh, who cares? That aren't micro, that are maybe even larger, where your brain's just like, oh, yeah, that's the better version. Who cares? And you just move on? Or is it all like there was intent behind that comma? There was intent behind that ellipsis. There's intent behind that name. Are there any that you allow yourself to just let go?
Yeah. So like I said, there's a 600 page version of Deep.
Yeah.
And there is a big plot that involves what is the U.S. government doing while all this is happening?
Right.
That's totally not there. It's implied at the end that they clearly have been waiting outside the city, but there are characters at some point in this version of it that do try to go into Juneburg, and things do not go well for them. And that's something that is probably 60 to 70 pages of plot and character development that is totally gone from the end of the book, and there wasn't really any pushback from me. I was like, okay, it happened still. We're just not going to know that it happened.
Yeah. It's funny because it was one of those, I was looking up it real quick. There's a LeBlanc line, actually. My favorite, if I can tell the author this, my favorite line was boy, have I been in this town my whole life. I heard the same whispers you did. I ain't had the courage to fight back, but I wasn't cowardly enough to join either. And I got to that line and I was like, there's been so much happening between certain characters. And it was almost like it took things like 100 degrees darker in one tiny little moment. And I just loved it because I enjoyed the audio so much. I went and listened to how Corbin played that as the narrator of the thing. And it's just as cool, like the Rain Corbin version in the audiobook. And because I really liked the performance of the Slicker Man on the audio. It's great. But I wanted to hear that line. And it's just perfect. Like it was such a beautiful way of being like, this is how we live in a time of evil. You give in or you don't. You listen. It's there. You know it, but you can be a good person. And I loved how succinctly and in the moment that's put on the page. And kind of later in the book also, once a lot of horrible things have happened, it looks like more horrible things can happen to this character. So it feels do you find that this book is increasingly, even though it's 2 years old, increasingly of the moment?
Yeah, it was intentionally built to be contemporary. I see patterns, on the autistic spectrum, you see patterns of behavior, right? And patterns of behavior are patterns, so they're sustained over a period of time. It feels like the contractions in towards that type of thinking have become more intense as our society is birthing more and more and more darkness. You know, obviously we exist in a time right now where trans people are actively under attack by people in policy making positions. So all that to say that, yeah, I think that it is more relevant now than it was even when it came out. And I think it's going to continue to be so, because it's very much so a story about people who are trying to do what they think is best. The subjectivity of what is best is so painted by our experiences of things that it's hard to step outside of ourselves to be objective enough to see that reality. And LeBlanc's able to cut through that in that way, where he recognizes his own shortcomings and not doing more to stop what's coming, but that he wasn't an active participant in accelerating it either. And that's, I feel like, a boat that a lot of us are in, where we always feel like we could be doing more to stop whatever's coming, but we rest easy sometimes knowing that we're not being an accelerationist about what's to come.
Is that good enough? I guess is the question that I have for LeBlanc. Is that good enough? What do you think?
Me? No.
I mean, you've answered the page. Yeah. You've answered it for the characters in the book.
Yeah.
So I guess, okay. Other than people, and this might be a gotcha question, but other than the authors here, are there other authors on the spectrum who are out there writing in any genre that you're like, this matches my experience? Is there another book that you're like, maybe I read this at the right time, maybe I didn't, but this is another person that is reflecting my experience? Are there other autistic authors or spectrumy authors that you really respond to outside of horror, outside of anything?
You know, it's hard to say because so many people who are autistic don't come out and say it for fear. So you're always trying to guess, is this person autistic? Am I reading too much into this? Maybe. But you mentioned his name earlier. Chuck Tingle is a fantastic author. I met him at StokerCon briefly. A lot of people like him. He was very popular. So I just did the, how you doing, Chuck?
Yeah.
And then kept moving. I'm not really the type of person.
He probably appreciated, he probably appreciated that.
But yeah, I really appreciate his sense of humor, his ability to be himself and be silly and over the top. Definitely a pioneer in this genre and in literature in general for people who are autistic.
You can talk about, I don't know if you're one of the people who doesn't like talking about stuff you're working on. Can you talk about what you're working on right now? Is it horror? Is it something you'd want to even bring up to a bunch of strangers on the internet? If it's not your process, I totally get it. But can you talk about what you're working on now?
Sure. I'm working on a 1970s period piece that's a Lovecraftian horror murder mystery with 2 points of view. One is a lesbian cop on the Boston Police Department, and one is an immigrant that has moved into Dorchester, and his brother is going into the Boston public schools during the busing crisis. So we're going to be dealing with the busing crisis of Boston with horror elements and missing children of color in brown communities and the police detectives that are trying to solve that murder mystery.
Damn. You have a title?
The Paper Lion.
How much? I mean, Deep is obviously insanely researched and insanely alive and insanely vibrant. Are you spending time in Boston? Are you walking around the street? Are you like talking to people? Are you picking up the kind of language? How do you recreate the 70s on the page for you?
So, I grew up, my mom was born in 1980. I have a teen mom, but my grandparents grew up in the 70s, in the earlier end of it. And they're from Boston. So I have some familiarity with it. I've grown up in Boston. I've spent most of my life in Boston. My goal is to create the most Boston novel that's ever existed that's not a guy with an Irish name. That's kind of the goal here.
Excellent.
And I think I've accomplished it. There's the opening scene, and I'm happy if you want to read a sample of what I have from it. I think you'll really enjoy it.
I totally would. I'm not going to like dance around it. I totally would love to read it.
It's the best writing of my career by far.
Awesome.
And I'm humble, I promise. But this is definitely the best writing of my career. And I've recreated a part of Mission Hill and Roxbury down to like the street corners. Like I spent 2 days in that neighborhood tracing the steps in which things would go and flow to recreate this scene. And I lived there for 20 years of my life. So I know how the streets work. I know how everything flows. I know what used to be and what was. And it's very well researched in some respects, but in other respects, because I grew up in it, I don't need to do that kind of research. I know how people from that area talk. I know how they talked back then. It's more of, was this theater renovated this year or was it renovated the year after? That kind of stuff that I wouldn't know because I wasn't alive, but is very easily look upable. But it's very authentic to Boston in the 70s, very much so.
As for a Peter, a hidden autistic character or a lead character, are you writing autism into this one or not at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So the lesbian cop character is going to be autistic coded, and she's one of the main characters of the novel.
How do you feel about, open this door, there's certainly a long history of autistic investigators who are not accepted by the neurotypicals until they solve a murder, until they do this. How do you just dispel those tropes? How do you write that for the modern day? I've seen good examples of it, but I hate to say it, I much more often see autistic investigators that you're just kind of like, get something wrong in the crossword, stop helping people from the IT department. How do you approach that in the shadow of so many bad examples of autistic coded investigators?
It's about reconstructing what the expectations are. So this character in particular, what I'm exploring in this novel is less about whether or not she'll be accepted by her contemporaries for her brilliance, but rather how much she's accepted by her own communities that she's betraying by actively wearing a badge in communities that badge is used to disenfranchise. She's a lesbian, right? She has a love interest that's a sex worker. How does that work? You're a police officer who's sleeping with a sex worker in the combat zone, which is the red light district of Boston until the 90s. And you're a lesbian. You're entering an area not too long after Stonewall. How are you being treated as law enforcement in your own queer spaces, and challenging the notions of what that means? So the acceptance that she's trying to achieve is more acceptance within herself as opposed to acceptance by people who uphold systems of oppression. There's a reality that, like, as an autistic person or as a person who's an outsider anyway, the likelihood of actually truly being accepted by these communities is next to none. Like, you know, I'm a relatively talented writer. I have fans. Obviously, I'm on this podcast. But at the same point, there's a lot of people who won't let me in the room because of who I am and what I come from. And it doesn't really matter what I say or do. I don't have certain credentials or a certain lived experience that is in their parameters of comfort that I know that there's going to be rooms I walk into and people are like, why is that person here? And you just make peace with that and you try to find ways to accept yourself. So that's how I approach writing with these types of characters. You know, even Zhang in Deep is very much so a person with deep morality and as a police officer. But to me, he's an idealized version of what a police officer should be, not typically what my experience of them has been. I mean, there's other characters in there that are maybe more like what they have been. But understanding that, like, those who uphold systems are always going to be struggling with the dissonance of how much of the system is worth salvaging and how much of myself is worth salvaging, and understanding that those can constantly be at odds, where I think a lot of people who write autistic characters are writing it through this lens of we need to be accepted for who we are, and watch, we can add value to society too. And my challenge to that would be that society needs to acclimate to what we provide anyway, rather than us trying to acclimate to society.
It's funny. When I was growing up in Houston, being autistic is wild, I guess, in rural Texas. But the spaces that I always, even though I'm totally straight, I always found acceptance in queer spaces in Houston, and found acceptance in queer spaces now that I'm in Los Angeles. And I didn't understand that as a kid. I didn't understand that as a teenager. I didn't understand that in my 20s, why everything felt a little safer. And I was like, oh, am I queer? Is this like something? Is this part of my life also? And it wasn't. And it wasn't for lack of trying. And it was just one of those things where I would see somebody in my day-to-day life in a restaurant, somebody that I knew at my school, and then I'd see them in a queer space unmasked and living this joyful, normal existence, and then becoming somebody else elsewhere. And I think that really, as an autistic person, I was like, oh, that just feels a lot better to me as a person. When writing that for yourself as a queer person, does that intersection of writing someone who is both autistic and queer, does that add another level for you personally where you can explore that, I guess, unmasked and masked space a little better than somebody like me?
You know, it's interesting because I think that up until this point, up until The Paper Lion, I've only written characters that have very specific elements of me. You know, I'm half indigenous. My family are descendants of Inca in Peru. They speak Quechua. They don't even speak Spanish. Well, they learned Spanish later, but they grew up speaking Quechua. My other side is Sicilian. Giovanni is very Italian, North Shore. Where I grew up, he's very typical of that experience, but only parts of me. The monologist, which you haven't read yet, is Patrick. He's a Irish gay comedian, not very similar to me at all, but explores my more parts of my tenderness. And I guess all that to say that, like, yeah, I explore parts of me in there, but very often it's a stylistic choice to try and write characters that aren't entirely reflective of me. I think there's an unspoken edict towards people of color who are writers that if we want to sell, if we want to do well, we have to write our lived experience on the page. And you might have noticed this with Deep. There's not a single Latino character in that novel, and that was a choice. I didn't want to write any characters that looked like me on purpose because there's so many authors, like you mentioned, Stephen King, writing autistic characters. There are so many authors who are allowed to create things that are totally out of their lived experience that I felt like, to me, in order to kind of reclaim my own identity in a way, I wanted to write things that weren't my experience and just be respected for my artistry without interfusing my own traumas and my own lived experience too heavily into it. But eventually, as I mature and develop and I have other works out, I feel like I'm able to explore those things and be respected in my totality. Whereas if I had started talking about intergenerational poverty in inner city America in my works, I wouldn't feel as strongly about that.
Is Paper Lion third estate, or how is it coming out?
It might be third estate. I haven't decided yet. I've had a few publishers who are interested in it. I haven't really shopped it around yet. It's not completed, but that introduction is enough to sell it.
Right.
I guarantee you it is incredible. But yeah, it might be third estate. It might not be. It depends. I'm very particular. I want an artist from that community to do the cover, and I want it to be like a fine art piece. And not all publishers want to pay for that, so I'll have to figure that out.
Yeah. I've had a merry time with publishers with art, and if you start saying, oh, I'll pay for it, or I'll do this, or I'll do that, people get amenable very quickly. So
yeah, that's true.
I don't know. I guess almost as like a kind of last question, I want to talk about like kind of what you get out of writing, the kind of organization of it and kind of the joy of it. Like, just what is your favorite thing about writing? What is the thing? Is it partly because it's a routine that kind of organizes, or what is it that you get out? Is it the validation from readers? What is the thing you get out of writing that you love the most? And it can be like 10 things. It can be one thing, but what is it that sends you back to the typewriter every day?
So there's two. One, I would say that, I have dysgraphia, which is a very common condition with people with autism. It essentially means my handwriting's illegible. I have a fine motor skills disability. So I tell people that I have like an artist's, like a visual artist, like a painter's sensibilities with my art, but I don't have their practicality and skill set. So I like to say that I'm an artist whose hands don't work so good, so I write instead. And it's very true. I think the way that I write is very descriptive in some ways and not in others, but it's very much so a stylistic and artistic choice. So I just create because I'm an artist and I have to say, and I have a lot of lived experience that I like to give to the world in hopes that somebody reads it and learns something about themselves. Which brings me to my second one. I continue to write because I know there's no voices like me in this space. There's some people who have some similarities in one pocket or others. I don't know anybody who has all these intersections of identities like I do in this space, and that's not disparaging towards anybody. We all have our beautiful life and unique stories. But all that to say that I'm writing so people who look like me or have some pieces of me feel represented. And I get emails all the time. Third Estate and all this stuff has been essentially self-published, do-it-yourself, punk from the ground up types of work. And I got an email even like a week and a half ago from somebody in Norway who said, I'm 57 years old. I just got diagnosed with autism. I bought Spectrum because I was so excited that there was actually work out there that represented me. And that's the kind of stuff that, when it's all said and done and they put me in the pine box, I want it on my gravestone because this is what I do. I like to think that I came from what I came from, Section 8, food stamps, complete poverty, to be able to give back to a community of people who share this one thing with me in such a profound way that maybe I'm even giving people their autistic awakenings. It's incredibly powerful, and it's the stuff you live for. Because that's what, to me, life's all about, is about making connections with people and learning from each other and sharpening each other's blades so we can be as sharp as possible in a world that doesn't really want us. I think that waking up every day is a radical act of defiance when you're an autistic person. And I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. That we exist in a world that's not designed for us, and we nevertheless try to make it a better place anyway. And this is my contribution to that.
Finding the way through that, even when you're in the generation it's diagnosed, that all your friends have the knowledge, have the understanding, have the vocabulary. It's still like, is life going to be okay? Is any of this going to be okay? And it's, as you say, it's stuff like finding that, yes, there is a community out there, finding that, yes, people are writing about this, that does that, that helps that. And I lied. That's not my last question. My last question is, so what is next for Third Estate? What is the next thing you have coming out? What are you excited about that you can't even talk about? What's going on with Third Estate?
Sure. So actually next week we're announcing this. I'll give you a little sneak preview here. We have 2 books coming out this year. One is by Paul Jessup called Suicide Music that comes out in June. We're still working through the editing process on that, and that one's a little bit further away, as we know. We have a book coming out at the end of March. It's our first novelist that's not a part of the Third Estate board. His name is Christopher Bond. It is a book that explores rural Ohio and familial grief. It was really important to me to kind of encapsulate a lived experience that's often overlooked in high art horror fiction, which is the rural working class American lived experience. This book is called Blackout the Stars. You have blurbs from Clay McLeod, Laurel Hightower, and I believe, is it Erica Worth? I can't remember her last name. Is an indigenous author from Colorado. Also blurbed it. It's fantastic. We're going to do the cover release next week. The cover was done by Todd Kiesling.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I know that work. Yeah, it's great work.
We're going in. We're going big or going home here for this first release. It's Christopher's first novel. He's a fantastic human being. We're very, very excited to be releasing that project, and hopefully people pick it up. And
sorry, what was the title of the Jessup novel again?
Suicide Music.
And what's that one about?
That one is, how much of this do I want to give away? It's about, I want to say, a young adult woman who is exploring her past through a different lens through the medium of music. That's about what I would say for it for right now. It's still an editing.
That's like
I don't know
really
how
mysterious. That's great. I mean, that's like you're kind of like, here's this most tantalizing, like, here's what it is. And now I'm like gone from, there's a book. And now I'm like, okay, now I want to read it. So that's a great description. How do you want to do it? Well, again, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I am looking forward to reading everything that comes next. But I mean, I'm also just looking forward to reading Deep again because there's so much stuff there. I really, really enjoyed it. So I just really appreciate you doing this with us and for our listeners who will hopefully immediately pick up the book as well. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
And that was Aquino Loayza. As I'm recording this later, I can tell you that the Todd Kiesling cover to Blackout the Stars is absolutely gorgeous. And you should check it and all things Third Estate Books out at thirdestatebooks.com. I can also tell you that I read the first 5 chapters of Paper Lion, and it's fantastic. I'm not going to spoil a damn thing, except the opening kind of stings if you're an LA Lakers person. But the prose is just as crisp and wonderful and filled with great dialogue as deep. So you've got something to look forward to. Anyway, you can find Aquino on Blue Sky at Aquino, AQUINO, author.bsky.social, and our publishing company, Third Estate Books, at just that, thirdestatebooks.bsky.social. Thank you, and tune in next week. NDAF. NDAF is produced by Ken Plume, and our theme song is by Mike Furman.